Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. A study brought out by Public Health England has raised worrying questions about the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine, known in India as Covishield, against the B16172 variant of the Indian mutation. And that variant, by the way, is the one that is now dominant in our country. This, in turn, raises implications about India's vaccination policy. And with me today to talk about both is the president of the Public Health Foundation of India and one of the country's most eminent cardiologists and epidemiologists, Srinath Reddy. Dr. Reddy, let's start with the PHE study, which says that a single dose of AstraZeneca, known in India as Covishield, only provides 33% protection against B16172, which is, of course, the strain of coronavirus that is now dominant in our country. And this, of course, has serious implications for India's vaccination policy. Before I come to that, let me ask you, you've read the report, you've studied it closely. In your eyes, is it a credible report, or do you have serious reservations and concerns?
It is a useful report, but it does have some challenges. It is useful because previously we had only data from vaccine trials, which were randomized controlled trials, but those were before the variants really entered the scene in a big way. So we were actually measuring up the efficacy of the vaccines against the original wild virus. It is only in the real world, now that the vaccination programs have started and the variants are now being discovered in their variety and number, we are also now going to assess how well these vaccines measure up against the variants rather than the original wild virus, against which they might have performed very well. And therefore, this particular study is very useful from that point of view. However, because of the several limitations imposed by the fact that the variants have entered the UK at different times. The first one, B117, emerged in the UK, reported from Kent, and subsequently the B16172 entered the UK at a later time. And also the vaccines themselves had different calendars. Initially, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was the first one approved and administered in large numbers, and the AstraZeneca vaccine came in for approval later and came into general use later. So you have different numbers in terms of both the variants that have been circulating and the vaccines which had to overcome these variants apart from the original wild virus. As a result, you have a number of places in which the reported analysis may have some impressive looking point estimates, but what are called the confidence intervals or the uncertainty intervals around them are quite wide and do not permit a valid comparison of one vaccine against the other or one dose against two doses. And that is where we end up with some uncertainty around some of the statements that I've made in the paper.
In layman's language, this uncertainty is to do with the percentages they give for the protection a vaccine gives or doesn't give. Am I right in saying that percentage is what is questionable because of the uncertainty?
Yes, let me give you an example. If you, for example, look at an estimate of 33.5%, then the range is 20.6 to 44.3. That you may say is perfectly okay because it still gives us a very clear-cut answer that it has not made the 50% grade, which is required for efficacy. So that particular statement that they have made, that a single dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine is not really providing the required level of efficacy against the B16172 is perfectly valid. However, when you start looking at the two doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine against the B1617.2, where the efficacy rate is now claimed to be 59.8% or close to 60%, which is reassuring, certainly as a point estimate. But because of the small sample size, the uncertainty band extends from 28% to 77.3%, as wide as the Brahmaputra. So what do you want to make of it? So you do require a larger sample size.
I take your point. Because of the smaller sample size, the uncertainty band can sometimes, particularly in the case of the 2-dose AstraZeneca, be so wide that you're not quite sure what to make of the figure that they arrive at of 60%. Let's take that as the context and the background for the discussion that we're going to hereafter have. And let's now, with this background, look at the report somewhat more in detail. And I'll start with the question marks they raise about the efficacy of the single dose of AstraZeneca. On the 13th of May, that's exactly 2 weeks ago, India decided to extend the gap between the first dose and the second dose of AstraZeneca, which in India, as you know, is called Covishield, from the existing 6-8 weeks to 12-16 weeks. But if the PHE study is correct, that a single dose only confers 33% protection, or if it's even correct up to the outer limit of 43-44% protection, it is still clearly insufficient. So talking about the single dose of Covishield, it means that anyone who gets it in India will have insufficient protection for up to 16 weeks. Is this therefore grounds for rethinking the 12-16 week gap and reducing it, as Britain has done, particularly for people over 50 and for the vulnerable, to just 8 weeks?
Well, let me qualify that a bit. I agree with you in general, but let me qualify it. There are parts of India where B117 is still widely prevalent. For example, in Punjab, Haryana, and Delhi. There, a single dose gives a protection of about 51% with an uncertainty band of 47.3 to 54.7. And 2 doses give you 66.1% with an uncertainty band of 54 to 75%. So if I were only worried about the B117, I might say the AstraZeneca vaccine is okay. On the other hand, if it is B1617.2, which is bothering me and which is spreading across India, then I would be very concerned about the very limited protection offered by 1 dose of the AstraZeneca equivalent vaccine here. So since I do not know which virus I'm going to be encountering in India as we open up, I would very much want to have the best protection against any variant that is seen in India, both against the B117 as well as against the B1617.2.
Let me put it like this. Harshvardhan, the health minister, made it clear at his press conference yesterday that the dominant strain of the virus is B16172. That being the case, the virus and the infection you're worried about is increasingly in India going to be what we call the Indian variant, not the UK variant. Therefore,
sure,
if the protection is only 33%, or at best, if you go to the upper range, 42-43%, is it wise to extend the gap and leave it extended to 16 weeks? Britain, after all, for the very same reason, has reduced the gap to 8 weeks for people over 50 and for the vulnerable. Should we not at least do the same?
Well, given the fact that if you go by the point estimates, despite the wide uncertainty interval, certainly the fact that 2 doses of this vaccine give you close to 60%, 59.8% protection against the B1617.2, I would certainly wish that as many people get both the doses of the vaccine rather than a single dose of the vaccine.
I'm not going to push you there.
Sooner the better.
Yeah, because you're using careful language and I want you to use blunt language. You are saying that we should narrow the gap. We should not stick to 16 weeks. We should reduce it.
Absolutely, because if you wait for too long, during that period, if the person is exposed to this virus, then the protection is very inadequate.
So
Therefore, we do need to protect them as fast as possible.
when you say reduce the gap, are you saying reduce it like the British have done for people over 50 and for the vulnerable to 8 weeks? Or are you saying reduce it for everyone? And secondly, reduce it to what? 8 weeks or more or less?
Well, frankly, let me answer both the questions separately. I would say our first duty is to protect the people who are most vulnerable. So in which case we have already chosen 45 and above as the real marker of vulnerability. So there certainly I would like to see the gap reduced because I'd like them to be as much protected as possible. Now I'll come to the gap period. Unfortunately, the AstraZeneca trial globally has played all over the field in a tap dance. You have had intervals of dosing of 4 weeks, you have had of 12 weeks, in some places you have had 16 weeks. The largest AstraZeneca trial in the US, in America, has had 32,000 people with 2 full doses given at 4-week intervals. And they had a fairly good efficacy rate of 76%. So as far as I'm concerned, there is no clear-cut point for us to say that 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 16 weeks are offering a great deal of difference. Though immunogenicity...
I'm going to interrupt you because I don't want the audience to get lost in the detail. The important thing is you're prepared to reduce it for people 45 and above, but to what point?
I would say 8 weeks.
So just to cap that, you're saying in the light of the PHE findings, even though there are question marks about that 33% figure, reduce it for people over 45 to 8 weeks. In other words, substantially reverse what the government announced 2 weeks ago.
Well, I would at least stick to the 8 to 12 weeks, preferably 8 weeks, but I would not go up to 16 weeks.
That's very clear. In fact, let me put it like this. It's now no secret because the government officially confirmed it. And in interviews to me, so did Gagandeep Kang, who's a member of the COVID working committee, that the decision to extend the gap up to 12, 16 weeks was taken primarily and particularly on the basis of UK real-world data. It's another thing that actually UK real-world data stops at 12 weeks and doesn't go up to 16 weeks. That gap of 12 to 16, as Gagandeep Kang told us, was taken on the basis of AstraZeneca trial results, not UK data. But nonetheless, the government's claim made in an official press release was that it was on the basis of UK data. That being the case, now that UK has real-world data that suggests that you should reduce the gap, once again, it will be consistent and logical to follow the UK. If you get guided by the UK in one direction, you should get guided by them in the other as well.
Well, if I look at the paper and only look at the paper for the real-world data that have been reported, after 2 doses of AstraZeneca, the protection reported is 59.8%. And in UK, they had given it at 12 weeks interval. But the uncertainty band, the uncertainty interval, because of the small sample size, is from 28% to 77.3%. What do I make of it? Therefore, I would rather say, certainly do not entirely dependent upon the real-world data on small sample sizes. Try and get much better estimates from our own data. But in the meanwhile, try and stick to the 8 to 12 weeks.
Okay, but your preference was actually, because you said this very explicitly, 8 weeks. Reduce reduce the gap for people over 45 to 8 weeks. That is a
for the simple reason that if I am told that somebody with a single dose of this vaccine, with a fairly credible confidence interval or uncertainty interval, which is relatively narrow, is going to have 33.5% protection against B1617.2, with the most optimistic estimate of protection being 44.3%, then I would still feel very worried about that person being exposed to this virus.
Absolutely. And that's why you're saying reduce the interval, reduce the gap to 8 weeks. And that, as I'm pointing out, is a fairly substantial reversal of what the government announced literally 2 weeks ago. Let's now come to a second part of that Public Health England study. It says that whilst 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine confer protection up to 88% against B16172, 2 doses of AstraZeneca only confer protection up to 60%. And on paper, that's a huge difference of 28%. But here, if I understood what you said at the beginning of this interview, you have concerns about the range. And that 60% actually falls into a range that at the upper end goes all the way to 77, and at the lower end, as low as somewhere in the 20s. So this time, am I right in assuming you have bigger, greater questions about this 60% figure?
Yes, I mean, I would like to believe it, because in the absence of any other data, I still have to go by what's called the point estimate. But in terms of actually statistically analyzing the credibility of this, it certainly has a too wide uncertainty band around it. So unless the sample size gets larger and we get a narrower band of uncertainty, we can't be absolutely sure about the 60%.
Let's leave for a moment the uncertainty band aside. You explained the problem about the uncertainty band. It's so wide that you can't be certain of the 60% point estimate that they picked. But leaving that aside, something that strikes the layman is that there is a 28% difference in the protection conferred by Pfizer and AstraZeneca or Covishield against B16170.2. Does that suggest that actually the AstraZeneca vaccine, what we call Covishield, is an inferior vaccine to Pfizer, at least with respect to battling B16172?
Well, does AstraZeneca vaccine pass muster in terms of the preset criteria of crossing a 50% efficacy mark, which is what WHO and many of the national regulators have said? I believe the AstraZeneca vaccine does pass that mark in the clinical trials. And even in the real world, it does actually cross that mark most of the time. However, Pfizer definitely came out as a winner with much greater point estimate of efficacy, as well as a much narrower band in this particular real world study, because obviously Pfizer started off much earlier in the UK. And if you look at what the 2-dose efficacy of Pfizer is, then against B1117, you have a 93.4% efficacy with a pretty narrow uncertainty band of 90.4 to 95.5. And even against B1617.2, you have 87.9% efficacy with a narrow uncertainty band of 78.2 to 93.2. So head to head, there is no doubt that Pfizer is well ahead.
That's very clear. I'm just quoting your words. Pfizer is definitely a winner. Head to head, Pfizer is well ahead. I've only got two more questions as I come to the end of this interview, but they emerge out of the impression that we're creating that in terms of the fight against B1617.2, which I keep emphasizing is now increasingly the dominant strain of the virus in India, which the health minister confirmed yesterday, Pfizer seems to be better than AstraZeneca or Covishield. And my first question is this. Newspaper reports have made it clear that Pfizer is willing for its vaccine to be used in India, but they want an indemnity against prosecution. And apparently, they've received similar indemnity in every other country where Pfizer is being used. The same newspaper report suggests that the Indian government is hesitant to agree. But given that Pfizer has a 28% better protection level against B16172, which is the dominant strain in our country, should the Indian government rethink its concerns? Should we find a way of bringing Pfizer to India as quickly as possible?
Well, as a public health advocate, I have a principled objection against pharmaceutical companies asking for this kind of long-term omnibus indemnity against anything. I believe it is absolutely unethical on their part. I'm not getting into the super profits they're making. So I am actually keeping the two issues aside. You asked me about the greater efficacy. I fully agree that it is a much more effective vaccine. There's no doubt about it on the basis of both the trial data and the real world data. Whether we should actually yield to the kind of indemnity bonds that they're asking for, that is a matter of policy I'd not like to venture into. We have to try and see how best we can get a good deal out of them for manufacture in India without compromising some of these principles where they're asking for sovereign assets to be pledged.
I can understand you're wanting to separate the two issues, but let me just say that the majority of the Indian people, at the end of the day, care about the best possible protection. And if Pfizer's is almost 30% better than AstraZeneca's, most Indian people would say, give them the indemnity. Every other country in the world where Pfizer is being used has given the indemnity. Don't try and be different to the rest of the world. Instead, give us the best protection that is available. And if Pfizer is it, give us Pfizer. But that, I think, is what the Indian people would say. Let's move to my second question, which again is connected to this issue, but it's a very different one. As you know, Dr. Reddy, we have given over 190 million first jabs, and that includes over 140 million second jabs, and 90% of them have been Covishield, which the world knows as AstraZeneca. Secondly, B16172 was first discovered in India, and undoubtedly we have more cases than any other country in the world. Why then are we dependent on data from Britain to assess the efficacy of AstraZeneca or Covishield against B16172? If we've got most of the jabs and we've got most of the cases, surely we should be the ones giving the world the data and in telling them the efficacy of the vaccine rather than depending upon them to tell us.
Absolutely. Because why would I have to struggle with this wide uncertainty bands because their sample sizes are so low when we have so many cases vaccinated and so many persons vaccinated and so many cases of COVID diagnosed? And I think it should be possible for us to put the data together in the real world and then say, how protective are these vaccines against the different variants?
And this means that we need to do a magnitude more of genome sequencing. The minister yesterday himself admitted we've only done 25,000 cases since the start of INSACOG in January. And that's a minuscule proportion of the total number of cases we have. It's also just a fraction of what Britain has done. We have to catch up because it's in our interest to do so. We must have the data that helps us judge the value and efficacy of our own vaccines, not be dependent on the world outside to tell us.
Absolutely. I mean, I too would like to be absolutely convinced or substantially convinced that 2 doses of the Covishield will provide adequate protection against B16172. But on the basis of the data presented from Public Health England, I cannot vouch for that because I said the sample size is too small and the uncertainty interval is too wide, far too wide. I'd rather have that uncertainty resolved from Indian data, from real world data from India.
Unfortunately, that's not available, and until we step up our order of magnitude, our genome sequencing, it won't be available either. But I thank you for this interview, Dr. Reddy, and in particular for pointing out that in the light of what PHE has shown is the efficacy of 1 dose of AstraZeneca or Covishield against B16172, it would be advisable of the government, at least for people over 50 and the vulnerable, but as you said it, to use your language, for everyone over 45, to reduce the gap between 2 jabs to just 8 weeks. That would be your preference. I hope the government's listening, because it is in everyone's interest that we get the best protection from our vaccines and not worry about the fact that a reversal of government policy suggests a loss of face to the experts who made it. Changing policy in response to the fact that the situation has changed is not a policy failure. As John Maynard Keynes said, and maybe this is a good moment to quote him, "When the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do?" That is a question that the government has to ask itself, and let's hope it answers it honestly. Thank you very much indeed. Take care, Dr. Reddy. Stay safe.
Thank you.